and welcome to the Intentional Clinician Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Krauss, licensed professional counselor. On today's episode, we are going to have a special guest, Andrew Tennison, who is the author of Killing the Bear, Surviving Teen Addiction. It's a true story of teen addiction and a guide for parents and others on how to help. A little bit about the book. Over the past 50 years, the face of addiction has changed in America. It has become much younger. It is estimated that 90% of serious problems with alcohol and drugs in our country begin between the ages of 12 and 20. Unfortunately, our efforts towards prevention and treatment of drug and alcohol use by youth have not kept pace with this new reality. Programs such as DARE have made no discernible difference in the rate of teen alcohol and drug use, and only 30% of our treatment programs for addiction provide services to adolescents. For parents who have found themselves dealing day to day with a teen caught in the grips of addiction, the gap between this new reality and the inadequate remedies is often overwhelming. As they see their teens slip into patterns of behavior common to addiction, apathy, aggression, dishonesty, and hopelessness, they find themselves lost and terrified. Despite a successful career in the field of mental health, Andrew Tennison was one of these such parents. While he knew how to help children and teens who had suffered from abuse and neglect, he knew nothing about how to help his own son, Ian, as he slipped into the netherworld of aggressive alcohol and drug use. Killing the Bear is his story about what it is like to be a parent of a teen struggling with addiction and what he did about it. Written for parents who are traveling a similar path or those who want to help such families, Killing the Bear provides a personal account and the practical ways of surviving this addiction. Okay, thank you and welcome, Andrew.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Paul.
Absolutely. So I have to say, first off, I loved the book. I hope it becomes more widely available, but people can find the book. So I will have the link to that in my notes of this show for people to purchase it, which I think is a very useful book. And I wanted to talk about a little bit about your story, if you're willing to just kind of tell the audience a little bit about yourself and the story.
Certainly. Well, as you read, I worked my entire adult career was working in the field of mental health, working with kids that had suffered abuse and neglect, serious abuse and neglect, and I was pretty successful as program director for that program. But in the middle of that career, my son began developing problems with alcohol and drugs, and I really didn't know literally the first thing about what was causing this. I assumed, like most parents did, that my son was my report card, therefore it had to be me somehow, that something I had missed, and I had to solve this problem for him. And almost all the approaches I used, or certainly all the early ones I used, really didn't make things better. In fact, it seemed to make things worse. So I began writing this once I finally got into some recovery groups, a local recovery group, and I realized that what I was going through, I didn't intend to write a book. It was more of a journal, and I knew what I was going through was significant, and I should be writing this down, because I wanted to remember this period of my life. And it was interesting, those early manuscripts compared to the way it actually turned out.
Yes, and in your story, there actually is a happy ending.
Yes.
I mean, it's still continuing, but
right.
Your son eventually did recover, and you have a fantastic relationship with him at this point.
Yeah, things are much better than when they were when this book began.
I wanted to say that, I wanted to spoil that for the audience so they could know that you do this, not every family has success, but you found some ways through going through this really difficult trial that lasted years that did help you. And in the book, you mentioned a few things already, but you are definitely very confessional about your own bewilderment, difficulties understanding what he was going through, and just the sheer amount of complexity of this situation. And I really appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, I mean, I felt having gotten into a recovery group, the basis of all recovery, in my view, is honesty, and I think you have to be honest with yourselves and other people, and that's really healing, to honestly look at things you did or things you missed. I mean, I was a good parent. A lot of parents that struggle with this are good parents. They don't have the information. They're bewildered. They don't quite understand what in the world has happened to their kid. They feel like some alien came and snatched their son or daughter away and replaced him with somebody else. And it's an astounding change for the parents, and they're just at a loss. And I certainly was. I think in some ways, it took me 8 years to actually get into a recovery group, which is longer than I would recommend. But
Right.
I showed up when I was ready. But my professional background in some ways was an impediment. There was a certain amount of arrogance and pride and shame. How could I have a son with this kind of problem? But I had to get past that. It took me 8 years to get to the point where I showed up at a meeting and began really listening. But I made it there, and that didn't cause my son to get better. He did that, but it allowed me to get out of the way and allow him to experience recovery without my interference.
A lot of good points were made right there, and I think one of the points that I really want to emphasize at the beginning here is that when you have a child or a loved one or anyone in your family who's suffering from an addiction of any sort, whether it be alcohol and drugs like we're talking about, or pornography or gambling or internet or food or whatever it is, or a phone for that matter, there can be a lot of shame around that and feelings of responsibility. And especially you being a mental health worker, we see all this data, the Adverse Child Experiences Study, when children are abused or neglected, all of these hard medical outcomes are worse, more likely to be addicted to drugs and alcohol, more likely to be obese, more likely to have risky sexual behavior, be arrested, have higher blood pressure, all of these things, right? So knowing that information, it's like, well, my child in all, from an objective medical model was not an adverse child experiences study. He wasn't abused. He wasn't neglected. My wife and I, this is what I'm reading from the book, my wife and I tried our best. We sent him to a good school. We invested all this time and effort in parenting and character, and you had involvement in your local church and all these other clubs and sports from what I read from the book. And yet then there was this, all of a sudden, like you said, like all of a sudden my son isn't who I thought he was, or who I think he should be, considering the environment he's been in, as a social worker. His environment, some things influenced his environment that were outside of your control. And as that's part of being a parent, is letting go of control little by little, like you said, getting out of the way. But I think it was very difficult. I could read in your story, it was very difficult to face how bad it really was, because this is not something you ever had expected to occur based on the lifestyle choices that you made.
Yeah, it's it's good for us to take into account what happens between a parent and a child, because it is significant, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the outcomes for children as they grow into adulthood are always determined by what a parent does or doesn't do. We certainly can have some influence, but as you said, I was 6 years on the school board. I was a school board president at a small Catholic school. Served as athletic director. I served on community boards to help with different projects. So I felt I was doing the right things. We were deeply involved in our kids' education. That was just part of the requirement at the private schools that our kids went to, and yet this happened, and I wasn't sure really how to deal with it. First of all, I did what most parents do. I blamed other people. That's always, unfortunately, what most of us do. When something goes really wrong, you have to find out, well, who's causing this? And it certainly couldn't be me or my family, so I had to be somebody else. But and I don't mean to make light of that. That tends to be the what a lot of parents do, and it's natural, but it's not productive. And that isn't to say we have to blame ourselves entirely, but we have to be honest about what we do, what we know, what we don't know, our own patterns of drinking, our attitudes about drug and alcohol use. And be honest with what we're seeing. If our son or daughter is really changing for the worse, we really have to be willing to look at that and not deny that or blame other people for it, but really pursue the help that's out there. Now, I'll tell you that the help that was out there back then, even the help that's out there right now, frankly, is pretty minimal. As you read earlier, 90% of addiction in this country, people that struggle with addiction, 90% of them began using during their teen years, and yet we have very few adolescent programs out there. And the programming should begin by middle school. That's when it began with my son, his experimenting. And, we know that 80 to 90% of the kids that struggle by late years in high school began in middle school years. That's something I had no idea of, and most parents don't. They cannot believe their middle school kid is starting to use. But that's the kids that struggle. That's when most of them begin using.
And that's a really good point. I want to jump off of just for a second to go right to brain science. So the younger you use, this is statistics, this is backed up by multiple research studies, the younger you start using regularly, the more difficult usually the addiction substance use disorder is to break. Because I think, from what I've read, you're wiring different experiences or different coping skills with the drug or alcohol. You're pairing it, and you're pairing it quite young when the brain is really developing. Now, we know from brain science that the new studies are saying that the brain kind of stops its growth pattern around 24 to 27 now, before you can still, learn new things, but it's not generating new cells like it was.
Yeah.
However, think about middle school, 13, 14 years old. I mean, your brain is very much in development, and if you start pairing that with drugs and alcohol, it becomes almost, part of yourself. Whereas if you start drinking or smoking or using drugs as an adult, you remember what it's like not to. And so, just with brain science, it becomes more difficult. And I think also, like you said, it's hard for parents to even fathom that this is going on. And, there's that shame factor. How could I have not known? Or also sometimes shrugging their shoulders. What am I supposed to do? Not let him go anywhere? Not let him have a phone? Keep him in my basement? They're supposed to go into the community. And, there's a network of kids who are experimenting for various reasons, whether it be coping or a thrill seeking or just, thinking that this is the thing to do. They can easily be exposed, and some don't regularly use, and they've experimented, and that's it. But if you have any genetic disposition for addiction, or are going through maybe a rough emotional time, which most teenagers are,
at some point, yes.
At some point or another, they do. They go through their own because of hormones and growing up and all of this. It can be an easy thing to quell some of your stress, and that's all of that. It can be dangerous. So I think, like what you said, it's difficult being a parent because you don't want to become the helicopter parent, and you also don't want to be the parent who's out to lunch and just hoping that things. So how do you navigate that, especially coming from your story, being so involved in his life, and then all of a sudden here we are, shock. How could this have occurred?
Yeah, we haven't talked about this, but eventually, one of the things I had the opportunity to do and the privilege to do was to start an adolescent treatment program at the agency where I worked. And one of the things that was most interesting to me was the onset of use and parental discovery of drug use. There was a 3-year gap there. That is, kids would, on average, started using around age 12 or 13, and parents discovered it at age 15 or 16. That was almost universal, that 3-year gap. And many of these were very good parents. They had other kids that did very well. By all sorts of measures, these were competent, good, caring parents, and yet they didn't see it. And that was certainly my experience. I didn't know until I began working in the field what some of the common behavioral signs, emotional signs, and just the physical signs. I learned certainly by living with the problem, but I wish I had known back then. I used to, when I gave talks at local schools and I would talk about the signs of use, there would be parents in the audience and I would just see their jaw drop or their head drop. When I talked about certain things, it was like the light bulb went on. Oh, that's what my kid's doing. That's what's going on. They aren't, though, the signs are not that difficult to detect if you know what to look for. And I certainly wish I had known that. And one of the things I did in those groups was to share with parents some of the things that would tell you if you see several of these signs, you should begin to investigate whether or not your son or daughter is using.
And that's a good point. And I think I want to talk about a few of those signs because I also think a lot of times a parent will bring a child to a therapist and they don't want family therapy. They want the child to go to individual therapy, which is more common for adults. Adults often go to individual therapy to work through something in their life, and that's what they do. And they sometimes go to couples therapy. But with children, we've talked already that off the mic that we think that it's absurd to not involve the family system unless the family system is the one abusing the child, which does happen. You worked in that environment for a while, but in your career. But if the family is a functioning family and non-abusive, and the members are trying to help, it's very important to get the parents into the therapist, even if the therapist sees the child independently for some sessions, but to always have that family therapy component because of various reasons. The child only has a limited view of what's going on. And also, going off that, my point was a lot of therapists and doctors and psychiatrists don't see it because they see all of maybe some of these moodiness or isolative behaviors as major depression, which it might also be co-occurring, but what is the obstacle, the cure for the major depression? Is there major drug use going on that's completely altering the mood as well? So can you talk a little bit about those signs?
Yeah, first I'll talk about my own experience.
Oh, yeah, let's go there.
One of the things in terms of this question, though, it's a very important area for parents to be aware of. One of the things, my son had started using marijuana in 8th grade, began experimenting, and by the time I discovered it 3 years later, it had really become a larger part of his life. Well, one of the effects of marijuana use, chronic marijuana use, and he wasn't using the low level, he was using the stuff the kids would call chronic, but just much more potent forms of marijuana. It affects their ability to concentrate and to learn. So he was struggling in school. So I took him to see a local counselor who specialized in treating ADHD, and sure enough, he had ADHD. I was told that, and prescribed stimulant medication, Ritalin or Adderall. I don't recall which. It was some time ago. But things didn't get any better because that was not the problem. I joked later on that he did have ADHD. He had always drunk and high disorders, what he had.
Right.
He was getting stoned every day, throughout the day, and it's difficult to learn, and that's what needed to be addressed. Now, as you said, there are co-occurring disorders, but one of the problems with chronic aggressive drug use is that it always looks like mental illness. Mm-hmm. It'll look like depression, anger, and certainly it'll look like family dysfunction if you see the whole family. The family, it may be a loving and caring, non-abusive, non-neglectful family, but when addiction hits a family, the normal course of events, unless the parents are in recovery and really know what they're dealing with, is to become pretty dysfunctional. because as the teen who is struggling with drugs and alcohol can't cope with life because they can't manage things, the parents and other family members fill in and try to take care of things for them, and it looks very dysfunctional. And a family therapist could look at that and say, well, maybe the kid's using because the parents are so angry. Well, maybe they're angry because the kid's using. And so it's important to really do it's important to do a diagnostic workup with not just the team, but also the family. When we ran the program that I was involved with, we spent the 2 hours doing an assessment with the team, but 2 hours with the family, and then we would get them together, because it wasn't that the family had caused this. They don't cause the addiction to occur, but they can delay the day of reckoning that every alcoholic or addict needs to get better by enabling, by blaming other people, by all sorts of things that parents typically do.
And it's, yes, and I want to go into that because the family system changes. We know from all the literature about, there was a lot of literature in the 70s and 80s about families of alcoholics.
Right.
And focusing on the father or the mother as the alcoholic and all the roles people took. Well, let's just reverse that for a second. When the child is dealing with an addiction, and that's the primary identified patient, as we say, the family system tries to adjust and adapt. They're doing the best they can, but they might be reacting out of fear, guilt, shame, thinking they can help a lot. So what you said, enabling, but a lot of parents don't see it that way. They say, I'm the parent, this is a minor, I've got to do my best, I've got to help. I've got to make sure that they're okay, and I got to make sure they're not emotionally distraught, and I've got to listen to their complaints, and I've got to, be there for them, because otherwise I'm a failing parent. And what you said right there, parents don't see it. That's the positive side. The shadow side to that is enablement and codependence, where my feelings as a good parent are dependent on how well my child's doing, and how well my child's doing, I need to be filling in these gaps or difficulties, school, whether it be school or achievement or ability to do well in something or cope with something. I've got to help them cope, but it becomes too much. So then the child, when they're little, you really need to help a child. When they're really small, you got to help them walk, you got to help them learn to talk, you got to help them make sure they don't stick their fingers in outlets, make sure they don't eat something they're allergic to, make sure they don't go outside at night by themselves, all these things. But when you get to teenage years, it's a little bit different. It's a little bit of both. You got to make sure they're safe, but what about letting them have the correct dose of stress so that they're in the zone of proximal development and learning to cope emotionally, and learning to do their homework, and learning to face difficulties. And when they are doing something such as drug use or something wrong or being disrespectful, holding them accountable. How do we do that in a way that's balanced and lets them experience stress, but not too much stress, not on the a lot of parents are reacting to that old world parenting that was authoritarian. They don't want to do that. So then they go too soft. They're running, like I think there was something in your book, I was running around with pillows, catching him when he fell. And so that's a difficult piece for parents. And so then, okay, well, I'll bring him to the therapist. Well, if the therapist doesn't understand that you have to also deal with the family system because they're treating this child like an adult client, and adult clients, yes, the family system could be very helpful to bring in, but a lot of times the adult does not want to bring their family system in, and that's their choice. For teenagers, unless it's an abusive situation, that shouldn't be a choice. That should be part of the treatment plan to have the family in, even if the family comes alone without the child, just to get some insight of what's going on. And hopefully, best practice, bringing them all together and doing some sessions. But that piece right there, I think you said delaying the day of reckoning or the day of facing what's going on. And I think parents don't know they're doing it. And it's very difficult to unravel that because of the multiple complexities. So can you elaborate on that?
Parents jumping in to try to help out. Unfortunately, the word enabling has become used so commonly that it's almost lost its meaning. So part of it, the way to understand this is really jumping in to try to help, but the help is really not helpful. One of the most interesting things I found in going to recovery groups were adults who started using as teenagers, who would tell you that I'm 45 years old, I have a job, I'm a competent professional, but I'm 14 years old. I've never really grown up, because part of adolescence is learning. You've been told all your life hopefully as a kid, you're the best thing since sliced bread, we love you, you can do anything. High school and the adolescent years, the time to find out that's really not true, but you're good at some things, let's find out what those are and let's really develop those. But also learning how to cope with disappointment and loss, frustration, joy, the whole range of feelings without falling apart. And unfortunately, if they've been coping with drugs and alcohol as a way to deal with these feelings, they really don't grow up emotionally, and that's a real risk. Parents don't do this intentionally. They sense at a basic gut level that there's something really wrong and I want to help out. So they help out in ways they've been doing all their lives with their younger kids, and it's not helpful. It's helping them stay stuck. It's helping them stay involved with drugs and alcohol, because they really aren't being challenged. Now, it's the way out of this is not easy. It's not easy for the teen, especially because of the paucity of services that are available to teens out there. We, unfortunately, in our culture, we wait till adults are almost completely broken and grudgingly provide detox services and maybe some counseling services, but really not. It's not offered graciously and willingly and at a level that's needed in our culture. And I don't know what it takes with the opioid crisis we have right now, what it takes to get people's attention that we need to do something about this. But anyways, the point is, parents mean well, but there aren't many services out there, resources out there, and so that, they try to handle it on their own in ways that really don't help.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And we will talk at the end more about what services are available and some of the support groups parents can get involved in for free if they can't afford services. And there's also books at libraries, and this book isn't that expensive. You can probably afford this no matter what your income level. And some things that we will kind of go to the solution side. But I think you're hitting on a macro issue, which is we have a cultural trouble in the U.S. with people growing up emotionally. There's a lot of reasons to not grow up emotionally. We don't have an agreed upon entry point. I mean, we say at 18 you're grown up, you can do what you want now, you're emancipated, and you can buy cigarettes and whatever. But we don't have an agreed upon way to have a child grow up emotionally. And so there's a lot of complexities. And I mean, you can read in the literature, there's countless books on this about how other cultures used to do it traditionally and how some parts of our culture do it and ways to do it. But I would say that that's not mainstream. I would say that that's not what is in the news as much, in the media especially. That's a complex issue. And you said the way out of this is difficult. So once it starts, parents are, might be panicking and not knowing what to do at all and just looking desperately for help. So I think that's a very good point. I wanted to ask you some more, maybe to share a little bit more about your story and what you did do, even throughout, we've talked about the difficulties, not seeing it. It got to the point where he got arrested and it was still difficult to see it. You tried, I don't want to give away the whole book, but you tried a multitude of different types of therapies with him that basically went nowhere because they didn't address the family system. That's part of the reason.
Right.
Which you found out from Hazelden was an important aspect, which you brought into your program. But what are some things that maybe brought you to the point where you changed the way you were working with your son and all of that?
Well, actually, oddly enough, failure helped. My failed attempts to do things, and I did what most parents do when my son first got arrested. I screamed and demanded he stop, and with no appreciation of how far along he was with his drug use. He was not just experimenting; it was more more than that. And so my screaming really just, he endured that, probably got high, and then ignored that. When the problem didn't go away, and this was odd because he was a great kid growing up. I never had difficulties with him listening or following the rules of the house. So this was a whole new thing. So I thought this screaming would work. Well, it didn't. So I eventually took him to a therapist when he got arrested again, and this therapist treated it as a ADHD problem, which, if you don't understand what the problem is, you're not going to come up with the right solution. He didn't need stimulant medication to be able to study better. He wasn't interested in stimulant medication. He was interested in marijuana. He wanted to mellow out. He didn't want to get, worked up. Eventually, you talked about parents taking it easy on their kids with the enabling. I certainly did that, but I also, at a certain point when that doesn't work, you revert back to the screaming. And so I did what most parents did. I screamed and I enabled and I screamed. I enabled because I felt bad about what was going on. I screamed because I got frustrated, and I enabled because I felt guilty about the screaming. I eventually found myself going to, after about 8 years of dealing with this, going to a mixed AA Al-Anon meeting, which was odd because I heard about this through my daughter. My oldest daughter told me about this meeting. I said, well, I had done a little research on AA and the whole 12-step movement. I said, there's no such thing as a combined AA and Al-Anon meeting. She said, well, maybe there isn't, but I went to it last night, so maybe you ought to. and I did go, and it was that was very helpful for me because I was able to listen to people that were in recovery who had problems like my son had earlier in their life, and they weren't angry, they weren't bitter, they were some of the most honest, decent people. And I needed to see that. I needed to see people could get beyond their addiction. And waiting inside every person struggling with addiction was a great person waiting to come out. Or at least I came to believe that. Maybe that's not true, but an awful lot of people, they're great people waiting to come out, but they just need to get into the recovery process. I needed to see that. I needed hope. I often tell parents, your son or daughter needs limits and boundaries. That's really important. You need to learn to say no, and it takes a lot more love to say no than yes at times. But they also need hope, and we need hope, and we need to go to places of hope. And that was a place of hope for me, to see people can get better. They can become not only okay, they can become great people if they embrace the recovery process. And a lot of them were in therapy as well. By this time I was reading a lot about addiction, trying to understand it. It's just the way I cope with things. I want to understand. Once I got past the denial and understood what I was dealing with, and if it's addiction, sooner or later you'll know. Sooner or later, no matter what, they get sloppy. They don't cover up their tracks nearly as well as they did in the early years. And you will know unless you're absolutely blind to it. But I certainly, knew what I was dealing with. I was studying it, but I learned so much by just listening to addiction, coming from people that were struggling with it. Everything I learned in those books was verified by what I heard these people talking about. It was I've read everything I can get my hands on. Just because the topic fascinates me, but I learned just as much by listening to people talk about their own struggles. And eventually, after about 4 years of going to that recovery group, there was a story in there. The guy that founded the group, he's since passed away, but he talked about his own situation with his getting into recovery and getting into treatment and recovery, and how his wife waited 24 years
patiently
for him to ask for help. because he wasn't abusive. He wasn't an unpleasant person, but he was an alcoholic. Clearly he was. And his wife knew that because she was in recovery herself. And she knew she had to ask him if he really wanted help. He had to ask for help, and she had to say, do you really want it? There was something about that story that just resonated with me. And when my son reached a critical point, I've been going to this meeting for about 4 years. He had been on a 1.5-day bender and was really suicidal, just like most people struggling with addiction will be sooner or later. My daughter brought him over, and he asked for help. And I said, do you really want it? I was kind of like the same scenario I had heard. And he said, yeah, I do. And my daughter about fell off her chair when she heard me say that, because she knew that I had been in this pattern of trying to shove recovery down his throat for 8 years in one way or the other, demand that he go to recovery and this and that. So for me to be asking, do you really want help? When he was asking for it, kind of floored her, but it was really the approach that worked. Because I had come to the conclusion, you can be supportive of someone's recovery, but you can't author it for them. They need to be the author of their own recovery. You can be a cheerleader. You can be supportive. You can provide resources. My wife and I paid for the treatment. By that time, I had decided, the boundaries I had set was I wasn't going to pay for lawyers, wasn't going to pay for fines, but bona fide treatment, absolutely. And we were lucky enough to find a good treatment program. And what was great about this treatment program, unfortunately it's not around anymore, but what was so great about this was the ongoing family involvement. We could go there for an 1.5-hour session on Wednesdays, and if we could stay and do the afternoon session as well. I went to both every week, and it was so helpful to be at the other end of the treatment, experience, being a client as a family member, but going through that process, family treatment. These were huge meetings, and at times it seemed a little chaotic, but it was so helpful. I learned so much, even when they weren't focusing on my son or us. The honesty, the clarity, was so helpful. And that's when my son really began. Several weeks into that, he said, my name is Ian and I'm an alcoholic. I was floored. And, it wasn't, things didn't work perfectly. There were relapses. There were some challenges, some relapses for me where I was hovering over him, which is not uncommon either. But he made steady, ongoing progress, and he's doing well now. Life isn't perfect, but it's going very well.
Yeah, and I'm glad you're bringing that up, because there was a long road. This is not an easy road, but I did hear some things, which was, as the parent, we can't just focus on the patient or the person who's got the addiction. We've got to focus on ourselves too. We got to take care of ourselves. We got to educate ourselves. We have to be honest with ourselves, and we may even need therapy ourselves or somebody to talk to about it because of the multitude of factors. With your son, I heard you hit some key points. Eventually, my boundaries were, I will not pay for lawyers. I'm not paying for fines. I'm not bailing him out of his poor decision making or getting arrested or whatever. I'm going to pay for treatment. So it's difficult for parents